Hello, my name is Frank Margonis. I'm a professor in education, culture, and society, and this is the second part of a lecture on the socio-political context of schooling. And the topic for this segment is segregation, race, and schooling. In metropolitan areas in the United States right now, um, you can visit one public school that may resemble a prison. There's fences around the property. To get in, you have to go through a metal detector. There's police stationed at the school. Students experience a high degree of surveillance from teachers and from police officers in their daily lives in the school. You can then get on the freeway, travel maybe 20 minutes, and ended up at another public school where you walk in and no metal detector, beautiful furniture, beautiful building, a sense of real comfort. You find a school with sophisticated technology, with outrageous physical education facilities, track, pool, um, overflowing library. These are often schools where you don't use a hall pass to go to the bathroom. Um, you know, that sort of difference um, has come to characterize public schooling in the United States. Um, and part of why you can have such a drastic difference in schools is that, some schools have a lot more wealth than other schools. Um, some schools are spending 26,000 per student per year. Some schools are spending 6,000 per student per year. Um, some schools simply spend 4 times as much as other schools. Um, this situation has been created by our combination of funding schools through local property taxes and having created a highly segregated society. So that's why we're going to talk about segregation a little bit. This is an extremely influential part of schooling today. Um, Cities in the United States are all segregated. The patterns of segregation vary from city to city, but most basically, the factors that determine segregation are both economics, wealth, and race. Um, the United States obviously has had a tough racial history. Um, Obviously, with institutions of slavery, with the genocide and removal of native peoples, the society created a situation where people of color were um, controlled, and the spaces in which they were allowed to be were monitored. In the U.S. South, after the Civil War, you had legalized segregation. Um, After that was found to be unconstitutional, I think we now have informal patterns of segregation. In the North during the Civil War and subsequently, there's always been informal levels of segregation. And now that legalized segregation is unconstitutional, we basically have very strong patterns of segregation in both North and South. Um, Sociologists estimate that segregation was diminished during the civil rights period. So we saw a period in the 60s and the 70s where we saw diminishing segregation, say, especially on the East Coast and the South. But in the 80s and 90s, we saw a period that people have called resegregation, where cities have become actually more racially segregated and sharply segregated by class as well. Um, recent patterns that help us understand this. Since the 60s and to the present, there have been large numbers of white families leaving cities and moving to suburbs. Often suburbs have been created and maintained as predominantly white spaces, predominantly middle class spaces. Many of those suburbs have been created, have created remarkable school systems. And so the goal of creating a great school was part of the goal of moving to the suburbs. And the whole package seems to be caught up with creating a racially homogeneous environment. Um, there's a whole history whereby the government and banks in this society have favored racially homogeneous communities. Banks have had a clear pattern of trying to maintain communities as homogeneous. This was very clear, say in the 60s and the 70s. If you were the most likely person to get a loan from a bank to buy a house was a white buyer moving into a white neighborhood. A very unlikely person to get a loan for a house would be an African American family moving into a white neighborhood. Documents from both the government and from banks show that there was a professional bias in favor of homogeneous neighborhoods and maintaining homogeneity. Sellers of homes have similarly sought to maintain the homogeneity of neighborhoods. There have been informal patterns where if you were a white person in a white neighborhood, you were not expected to sell your home to a person of color. This was actually legalized for many years, in many cases, by what they call racial covenants. This would be a case where when you bought your house, it was written into the deed that the house could only be sold to a Caucasian buyer. Those covenants were found to be unconstitutional, but the pattern of selling, partly based on race, continues to the day. Real estate agents have also been shown to be complicit in this process, often steering people who are looking for houses, showing white people houses in white neighborhoods, people of color houses in neighborhoods where there are people of color. So these are just some of the mechanisms by which our society is remaining racially segregated. When you combine these racial patterns of segregation with a society that is economically very unequal, I mean, people who are making hundreds of thousands or millions a year, and people who are making 25,000 a year. What we see in metropolitan areas are sections of the city, some very well off, some very humble and very poor. In our metropolitan areas, that's what we end up with are areas in which wealth is concentrated and areas in which poverty is concentrated. Gary Orfield and the folks at the Harvard Civil Rights Project have studied the concentration of youth in low-income schools. They have a website if you want to look up the Harvard Civil Rights Project. Just give you some examples. For African American students, on average in the United States, they attend schools that are 59% low income. White students, on average, attend schools that are 31% low income. Now, and then here's a more extreme indicator. 40% of African American and Latino youth in schools are in schools that are 70 to 100% low income. So in other words, 40% of African American and Latino students are in schools that are already economically struggling, and they might be within some of those neighborhoods where the economies are not thriving. And those factors play a role in what kind of services those students are going to get in those schools, shaping the opportunities of what youth can and can't do. Okay, so that is the most obvious way in which segregation plays out, you have wealthy neighborhoods, wealthy schools, high levels of motivation in those contexts, poorer neighborhoods, poorer schools, less economic motivation in those contexts. As you know, right now we're in a situation where many parents and students look around to schools. They look for a school that they think will be best for them. And what we're finding when parents are interviewed is they're looking for schools in upper middle class white areas. I mean, there is the assumption that those areas with the thriving economies and the thriving schools will be better than the schools that do not have a thriving economy. We also know from educational research that segregation plays out within schools as well as between schools. That is, students within a school are often treated in relationship to the neighborhood they come from. This is something that came out of a study done by Pedro Noguera, and he was studying Berkeley High School in the Bay Area. And Berkeley High is a high school that serves working class youth and a diverse student body racially and ethnically. It draws from many different neighborhoods in the Bay Area: working class neighborhoods, middle class neighborhoods, upper middle class neighborhoods. Like most high schools, Berkeley High offers classes at lots of different levels. For example, in math, you can have advanced placement in math, start with an algebra sequence. You can have college preparatory math, or the lowest sequence starts with pre-algebra. And one of the things Noguera did was he looked at who ended up in the pre-algebra track versus who ended up in advanced placement mathematics. And what he found was a very clear representation of, or overrepresentation of, working class African American and Latino students in the lowest math track, that is the pre-algebra track. In fact, in that track he found 83% of the students were African American and Latino working class youth. He found also that every student that transferred into Berkeley High from Oakland ended up in the pre-algebra class. And indeed, Noguera came to the position that you can predict the sort of treatment or services a youth is going to get at a high school based on the neighborhood they come from or their zip code. And that's how he does, in fact, predict the educational experiences youth experience at Berkeley High. So when you enter a school, look for patterns of segregation. I mean, that is, look at the surrounding neighborhood. Look at who's in the school. Look and see when you enter a class, who's in the back row, who receives the teacher's attention. If you see ability groups at the elementary level, who's in which ability groups, who's in the high ability groups, who's in the low ability groups. If you go into a high school, look at who's in which track, who's in the college preparatory tracks, who's in the advanced placement tracks, who's in the vocational tracks. The disturbing thing is that these patterns of segregation play themselves out far more often than not. And as an educator, it's important to recognize when people are granted good services and when they are being denied services they are due.